All right, welcome back. We are going to talk about a local rivalry to us at NKU, that being the two most prominent programs historically in the state of Kentucky. When we talk about athletic programs, intercollegiate athletic programs, and those of course are the University of Louisville and the University of Kentucky. And we will also talk for a few minutes about rivalry series, and I'll give you a few examples both in intercollegiate athletics and also around the world. So let's get started with this one. This is one that some of you, depending on if you're from the area, might know a little bit about or have a rooting interest in. I don't particularly, although I've been to several Louisville games and have yet to make it to Rupp Arena. Hopefully I will sometime soon. You might think of it as being a historic rivalry because these programs have quite a bit of history behind them, but in actuality, it's not quite as historic as you might think, or not as historic as some of the other major rivalries. Let's take a quick look at, we'll use Wikipedia here to show us the history of the rivalry. You can see that they did meet in the relatively early 1900s, just before World War I, a few times, Kentucky getting the best of Louisville. And they did play somewhat regularly for a little while, and then just played a couple times in the 1920s, and then just 3 times in the 1940s and 50s, and then you notice a huge gap here. They did not play at all from 1959 to 1983. And another key here to notice, when they did meet in 1983, it was in the NCAA tournament, right? So it was the NCAA that brought these two programs back together to meet again after a drought of over 20 years. Was that about 24 years? And you can see that even in the 50s, their only meetings were also in the NCAA tournament, 1951 and 1959, which means they did not schedule each other intentionally at all between 1948 and 1983 in the regular season. And there's a whole long history behind that, and part of the reason for that and that history is pretty well summarized in this book, Fighting Words. So I'm going to mention it and promote it just briefly for those of you that are very interested in this rivalry, because Ryan Clark, one of the co-authors of this book, was actually an employee at NKU for quite a while, and when he used to work at NKU, he would come into my class when I teach this course in the classroom and talk about some of the background to his book that he wrote here. And this book features a lot of the defining moments in the rivalry and a lot of the history behind it. But what Ryan would explain in class, and what the book outlines in more detail, is part of the reason for that long gap of these two storied programs not playing each other despite being the most prominent programs in the state. Maybe you have a guess at that, or maybe you might know what was famous about the University of Kentucky program during that period. I just a second ago, or as we were starting out, mentioned their arena, and it's named for perhaps the most famous individual in Kentucky basketball, at least in its past history, and that being Adolph Rupp. And he had a pretty strict policy against playing any teams in the state, which of course meant Louisville. His feeling was that the University of Kentucky really had nothing to gain by playing any programs in their own state, meaning if they played them, they were expected to win the game, and if they did win, it wasn't a big deal because they were expected to, and if they lost, it would be a huge deal for the other programs to say that they beat the University of Kentucky. So Adolph Rupp refused to play Louisville or any other team in the state, and his predecessor, pretty much stuck to that. Joby Hall, I think, is who preceded, or not preceded, but who was subsequent to Adolph Rupp, who was after Adolph Rupp, and was one of his assistants. And so he stuck with that policy, so they did not play each other for that long period. Now during that time, a pretty famous coach in his own right, Denny Crum, took over the program at Louisville. Denny was from UCLA, and if you know your college basketball, you know that UCLA, along with Kentucky during a period, but UCLA was kind of the most prominent program of the 60s and 70s in the country, winning strings of national championships. And Denny Crum was the top assistant to John Wooden at UCLA before he came to Louisville. So he comes to Louisville and he really rebuilds that program into a powerhouse, willing to play a national schedule, non-conference schedule. Also very eager to recruit the best possible players out of the city of Louisville and even out of the state of Kentucky as much as he could. Kentucky had a disadvantage when it came to recruiting in that Adolph Rupp, for all of the positive things that he achieved at Kentucky, is also known for one extremely negative thing, that being racism, and his refusal to recruit black players for a very long period of time. And that, of course, helped the Louisville program because they were happy to have players of any race come and play as long as they were great basketball players. And so that makes it, over time, that becomes a pretty big disadvantage for the University of Kentucky. If you're only recruiting from part of the talent pool, that is certainly a disadvantage. And even after Kentucky integrated its teams, it still had that stigma for quite a long period of time. We can make analogies to the Red Sox that suffered that same problem when they went through a racist era in their history, and then even after the team integrated, there were a lot of black players that did not want to play for them. Same thing for the University of Kentucky. For quite a while, it took to overcome that stigma that was attached to their program. So anyway, the NCAA tournament says, enough of this, we're going to try and match these two teams up in the early 80s using the tournament brackets. And in 82, they actually, I think it was 82 or 81, says in the book, that they had them matched up in a Sweet 16 round in the bracket, and I think it was Kentucky that lost that particular year early on, although I'm not positive about that. But one of the two teams lost early, and so the NCAA was unsuccessful. They were upset early. So the NCAA was unsuccessful. They tried again in 83, and it did work. They ended up playing each other in Knoxville, so very close to Kentucky, to the state of Kentucky. Easy drive for fans of both programs down to Knoxville. And the game went into overtime. So it led up, or it held up to the excitement in the building of these teams having not played since the 50s. The TV ratings were great. There was lots of excitement. The building, of course, was sold out. Goes into overtime. And so after that happened, the legislature actually in the state of Kentucky said, enough of this, you two not playing each other, you need to play each other in the regular season. And a congressman or a legislator actually sponsored a bill that the governor then, I don't know if he actually signed the bill or he just went to the presidents of the universities and said, hey, do we really have to make this a law in the state of Kentucky that you two have to play each other? And anyway, they did. And so after that, in the 80s and now 90s and now into the 2000s as we know now, they do play each other pretty much every year. They make it a priority to work out the scheduling so that they can play each other. And of course it gets a lot of national TV exposure with both programs being very prominent. So that's the story as to, yes, they do have a long history, meaning they first played about 100 years ago, or a little over 100 years ago, but you have huge gaps. So you don't have the number of meetings that some other historic rivalries have in college basketball. But recently, as I mentioned, they have played each other every year for the last few decades. This is This is a rivalry that has been relatively dominated by one sport, meaning the focus is on one sport, versus some other rivalries that we'll look at here in just a few minutes that get emphasized across multiple sports. And the governor actually got involved in this as well, sponsoring what's called the Governor's Cup in football to try and extend the rivalry that had developed in the 80s and early 90s, to try and extend that excitement for the entire state away from just men's basketball and into football as well. So the Governor's Cup started in 1994, is what these two teams play for on the football field. And somewhat recently, with Louisville's move to the ACC and the SEC's collaborative work with the ACC to try and hold open that last weekend in the football regular season calendar so that the SEC schools that have rivals in the ACC can play each other. We've seen that game, the football matchup between Kentucky and Louisville, move to the end of the schedule, whereas for a little while it was played sort of whenever they could schedule it, sometimes on Labor Day, early in the season when there are a lot of non-conference matches, but with the leagues then starting to work together and Louisville's move to the ACC, that's nicely resulted in this rivalry game happening at the end of the season. Other examples of teams that play that weekend: Georgia Tech, of course, also an SEC-ACC rivalry. South Carolina and Clemson, also an SEC-ACC. Virginia and Virginia Tech, I think, but that's not it. That doesn't involve an SEC team. I think there's at least one other SEC-ACC rivalry that takes place. But anyway, good to see those leagues working together to promote the sport as a whole and promote the idea of rivalry. So postseason play has played a pretty big role here. If we quickly go back to our chart here, you could see that it's postseason play that the NCAA kind of got them to match back up there after that long gap. And then, of course, you've got the 2002 Final Four, and then again in 2014 in the Sweet 16. And you notice on this list, it's nicely colored for us, that we see more blue than red. But at the same time, we do see a decent amount of red here, meaning Louisville wins over Kentucky. So yes, Kentucky does lead the all-time series, but certainly it's been relatively competitive since they began matching up again in the 80s, where Louisville does pick up wins every few years. All right, back to our discussion slide here. In total, at least at the time that I'm recording this, they have met in the postseason 6 times. Kentucky's gotten the better of Louisville 4 of those 6. In football, they've only met 26 times, and that one is pretty even. UK 14, Louisville 12, so pretty evenly matched in football. And there is, just like you have Pitino on the basketball side that became famous coaching Kentucky and leading them back to prominence in a national championship team, and then leaving for the NBA and then coming back for Louisville, a huge, I don't know if scandal is the right word. I don't know, I probably shouldn't use the word scandal around Louisville basketball. But anyway, getting off track. He's, of course, a defining person or a star in the rivalry that switched sides. You had the same thing in football with Howard Schnellenberger, who was a former UK player, and then he coached Louisville in the 1990s, and he was instrumental in getting the governor to sponsor that Governor's Cup to try and raise the profile of the rivalry in football. Schnellenberger is also famous for bringing Miami, the Hurricanes, to prominence as well. As a football program. So why are these teams rivals? Well, let me get my chalkboard out here and we can fire up our list. You've got this geographic element here. They're not that far away from each other, as most of you probably know. It's a pretty easy drive between Lexington and Louisville, with the capital of the state, Frankfort, sort of right in the middle there. So geography, they're the two most prominent programs in the state. They're kind of fighting for state supremacy. Certainly you have competition for personnel. We talked about a famous coach on the basketball side that went between the two, but they tend to recruit the same athletes as well. The best athletes, of course, in the state, but both have national recruiting footprints. So we've got geography, we've got competition for personnel. I think we could put recent parity on here. Certainly in football, although Louisville at the moment seems to be doing pretty well football-wise in terms of having a top program, maybe a little more so than Kentucky, but Kentucky's still beating Louisville, even when Louisville was highly favored. And on the basketball side, it's kind of reversed. Kentucky has gotten the better of Louisville, but Louisville certainly gets their wins on that as well. So we'll put recent parity on here. Star power, both in terms of players and coaches. Of course, there's tons of NBA players that came out of these programs, and the coaches are certainly superstars in their own right. I'm going to put frequency of play on here just because they do play each other every year, and when you're in different conferences, you of course have to prioritize that and make a point of it. The conferences are not scheduling it for you necessarily, and so they have made it a point to play each other every year. And we could also put on here defining moments, which I don't have on here, but I mentioned that the book, Fighting Words, talks about a lot of those moments. I won't go through them all here. But as you can imagine, some of those are the postseason play that they've had, tend to be defining moments. And then also, I'm going to put on here cultural difference. Now, I mentioned that Kentucky's racism in terms of recruiting ended quite a while ago, but you still have a difference in the cultures of these two schools, and some of you will be quite aware of that. Louisville's long been looked at as kind of the city school, whereas Kentucky is more of the rural school, although Lexington is not entirely rural. Kentucky's seen as representing the entire state. Obviously, they had the benefit of their name, the brand, of the entire state, University of Kentucky, and Louisville just has the city brand, perhaps somewhat analogous to University of Cincinnati versus Ohio State, right? They get to claim the whole state as Kentucky does. And Louisville's more of that urban kind of environment. Louisville has not always been a public institution. I believe it was in the 80s or maybe late 70s that Louisville, through an act of the legislature, became a fully public university. It used to be private before that time, which makes it a little bit different as well. Kentucky's quite a bit larger than Louisville, although Louisville has grown a lot over the years. So lastly, as it relates to this rivalry, I would say, if I was in the athletic departments of either of these two programs, I would be interested in looking at some of these elements of rivalry and saying, how could we use some of these elements to expand this rivalry and the excitement around this rivalry beyond not just men's basketball, but further promote the football rivalry, promote the women's basketball rivalry, maybe a soccer rivalry, baseball. You have two pretty good baseball and softball programs at these institutions. So how could this maybe turn from just being one that primarily gets men's basketball attention to one that is around multiple sports? To that end, let's talk about rivalry series development for just a few minutes here. Of course, one that's not really relevant in our discussion of Kentucky and Louisville, where we know who the rival is, for some newer schools, such as Northern Kentucky University, a good place to start is who might be our rival. Who do the fans consider a rival? Sort of a funny anecdote here. UConn decided that they were going to promote the University of Central Florida, that's UCF, as their rival. Both of these schools were in the AAC conference at the time, the American Conference, American Athletic Conference. And you can see they even created a trophy in the graphic here that UConn was promoting on their Twitter account. The only problem here is that UCF was unaware that this was a rivalry. So first step, decide who your rival is. Check with your rival perhaps to see if they are willing to reciprocate. I will be the first to grant you that not all rivalries are bidirectional, meaning reciprocated, but if you're going to try and create one for publicity and for excitement of the fans, it's probably a good idea to try and see if you can find one that could be reciprocated. An example here, more on a higher level, Nebraska, right? Changing conferences quite a while ago now, but when they switched to the Big Ten, their big rivals, particularly Texas and then also Oklahoma as well, they left behind in the old conference. And because of the limited football schedules, you don't have the same amount of non-conference games you do in basketball. They weren't able to continue those series or chose not to for whatever reasons. So Nebraska was trying to figure out who's our rival in the new conference. And one thing that might help them, you see a little screenshot here of the Nebraska page on our No Rivalry website, the website that I run with my research partner at he's at Western Carolina University. That's, if you want to check it out, you can, KNOW rivalry.com. Nice little shameless plug. But we do have lots of data from fans across the country, not just in college football, but also in professional sports. Here we're looking at a screenshot of Nebraska's No Rivalry page, where their fans get 100 points to allocate to across any number of opponents, 100 rivalry points. And you could see how Nebraska fans allocated their rivalry points. Oklahoma still picking up over a third of their points here with 36 points, but Wisconsin, it seems like, and then followed by Iowa, seem to be who their fans see as the most likely rivals within their new conference in the Big Ten. And then the bottom box gives you a summary of who saw Nebraska as a rival. And you can see Colorado really focuses on Nebraska. But if you look back to the top box, you see that Nebraska doesn't reciprocate quite as much. Oklahoma does reciprocate somewhat. And it seems Iowa does reciprocate somewhat that feeling. So out of the Big Ten opponents, it seems Iowa reciprocates a bit more than Wisconsin. You do see Wisconsin makes the list, but only allocates 8 of their 100 points to Nebraska. So anyway, it gives you some data that if you're a sport administrator, you can use when you're thinking about developing a possible rivalry campaign or a rivalry series. And sure enough, Nebraska did work with Wisconsin to develop the Freedom Trophy that they trade back and forth. This is just a football rivalry. And they also created what they call the Heroes Game, sponsored by Hy-Vee, which I believe is a convenience store or grocery chain in the region there. So they have the Heroes Game. That typically happens toward the beginning of the season, the Big Ten schedule, and then they play Wisconsin later in the schedule for the Freedom Trophy. So they actually created 2 different rivalries. Here's a few examples of rivalry series that also have sponsors attached to it. So from a sports business perspective, this creates some inventory that these schools can sell to sponsors. Also helps them promote the rivalry. Oklahoma and Oklahoma State. Of course, the football game is the most prominent for those 2 institutions, their football meeting, but the Bedlam series is broader than just the football game. They have a point system across multiple sports. The Governor's Cup, a little closer to us than Oklahoma, the Indiana, which is the Indiana-Purdue rivalry, and you see that has a sponsor as well. The Black and Blue rivalry is of mid-majors. That's Long Beach State and University of California, Irvine. And you see it also has a sponsor. And the Territorial Cup is a really big rivalry in Arizona, which is Arizona and Arizona State. I created the Rivalry actually when I was I didn't create the Rivalry, but I helped brand the Rivalry series when I was the marketing director at Miami University, and we did a poll of our fans and students, and to no surprise to us, Ohio University won as the top rival, and I worked with some of the staff at Ohio in their athletic department, and we came up with the name the Battle of the Bricks. I don't know if you've ever been to Oxford, Ohio, where Miami is, or if you've been to Athens, Ohio, where Ohio University is, but they are beautiful red brick campuses, both of them, and we thought it would be fun and unique name to call it the Battle of the Bricks. Also fun carryover to sort of basketball as well, maybe some foam bricks as a giveaway or something like that. The Carlisle Cup is what the Rivalry series was called between Duke and North Carolina, so that was across multiple sports. Carlisle is a jeweler in the North Carolina area. And when that sponsor did not renew the sponsorship after several years, it got changed to the Battle of the Blues with Continental Tires as the main sponsor for that. So involving a sponsor can sometimes, it can bring you some revenue, but at the same time it can create a little bit of problem if you have to change the name because the name used to involve the previous sponsor, in the case of the Carlisle Cup. There can also be some instances, here's an international example from El Clasico, where Audi sponsors both Real Madrid and Barcelona, and they use their sponsorship of both teams to promote the rivalry together in the same advertisement. Here you see an Audi branded FC Barcelona, the one on the left there, and the one on the right has Real Madrid branding, and in the commercial itself, the two drivers kind of like drive competing against each other. I was in the athletic department at Ohio State over a decade ago when OSU and Michigan announced that they were going to brand their rivalry in football with selling the sponsorship to SBC. However, back then it was so controversial that within 2 days the University of Michigan killed the idea. They got so much backlash from their alumni about how could you put a corporate sponsor on this great game that they then backtracked and said that they didn't want to do it, turning down, I think it was about $400,000 over a 3-year period because of the backlash. Now, of course, they could probably sell it again, and there would be much less pushback given that sponsorship is much more prevalent now, and you just saw all those other examples of sponsored rivalries. Here's a few more. The Civil War series between Oregon State and Oregon. You see they have several sponsors attached to that series: Wells Fargo, Pacific Source, Ford, and McDonald's. Here's an example of sponsorship activation. This is the rivalry between UCLA and USC, sponsored by Muscle Milk, and you see that they have even wrapped a bunch of the Muscle Milk containers in this. So this is a great example of how having a sponsor attached can really help promote the rivalry. Locally, we can think about what Skyline does to help promote the crosstown shootout with UC and Xavier. This example, of course, being from the West Coast with Muscle Milk. And here's another international example, the Battle of the Bridge, which is a couple of rugby teams in New Zealand. And you could see they have a sponsor also attached to it. So this is not a phenomenon just in the US or just in Europe in the case of El Clasico, but we see it as widespread as New Zealand as well. So hopefully this gives you a few ideas of what's out there and what's being done with Rivalry Series. And that's it for now.